welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. I'm Nwankwo Ogun Yusuf. Exactly a week ago, a coalition of civil society organizations signed a statement wherein they stated their displeasure and disapproval of newly nominated resident electoral commissioners whose names have been submitted to the National Assembly for screening and approval. For context, the tenure of 19 resident electoral commissioners came to an end recently. About 5 of them got reappointed, while 14 new names were presented to the Senate for confirmation. Of this number, the civil society organizations cite the names of some of the nominees whose nomination they say does not comply with Section 156A of the 1999 Constitution, which prohibits the appointment of any person who is a member of a political party as a member of INEC. The third schedule of the Constitution, Part 1, Item F, Paragraph 14.1, also states that commissioners shall be non-partisan and persons of unquestionable integrity. This is not the first time CSOs will be taking objection at some of the names that have been sent to the National Assembly for screening and confirmation. In July last year, the nomination of a presidential aide, Loretta Onochie, as a national commissioner was roundly rejected by the Senate on the grounds that there was already someone representing her state, although the opposition and political parties and other CSOs had pointed to her partisanship. Now, is there merit in the new allegations that CSOs have made? Should filial relations with members of political parties affect and constitute non-partisanship? Should there be clearer grounds for disqualification of nominations? And where it hasn't been kept to, how effective can the National Assembly be in truncating nominations that could affect the integrity of the nation's foremost electoral body? These are some of the questions we hope to provide answers to tonight. And my guest is Mr. Clement Nwankwo of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC. Mr. Nwankwo, welcome to Hard Copy.
Thank you, Mokwe.
Well, I'm sure you must have seen the statement by the coalition of CSOs. I think there was another one, I'm not quite certain, talking about capture of INEC. I do not know if I saw that they were alleging that INEC, they were afraid that INEC could be subject to state capture. Is it a fear you also share?
I think there's been several statements issued by different people. I know the Situation Room did put out a statement, even sent a letter to the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission Committee in the Senate. The political parties, some have issued statements, and I know that a lot of the senators before whom this nomination is coming to for screening also have their concerns. But yes, I think that when you look at the Independent National Electoral Commission, when you go back to the very difficult days of INEC's operations in 2007, when that election was held, that raised uproar around the world and led to the late President Yaradua of blessed memory setting up the Electoral Reform Committee. The fear I think a lot of people are having is whether we are returning to that age when people are appointed into INEC and when the INEC partisanship becomes more prominent. And I think that it's very sad to see that these fears are arising. For a president that is not running for re-election and who has promised to bestow an election that would be credible ahead of his leaving, I think that the president should have been more concerned, more discerning in making a decision. If you do remember, part of the recommendations of the Ways Committee was the creation of an independent body under the National Judicial Council that would scrutinize and screen nominees from applicants who want to be in INEC at the national body or INEC representing INEC in the states. This recommendation didn't pass, but then we saw in the commission's, the constitutional amendment that was made and the reforms that were made under the 2010 Electoral Act that when President Jonathan made appointments, he appointed one of the members of the Ways Committee, Professor Tahiru Jega, and then most of those who were then appointed into the commission, clearly the President Jonathan at the time, made sure that they had no political affiliations. What we have seen since then, and since President Jonathan lost the elections in 2015 is that a majority of those who have been appointed into the Electoral Commission are having questions raised about them. And I think that when you saw what happened, you did mention the Loretta Onochie issue. There were even concerns raised about some of the national commissioners that were proposed and their affiliations with political parties. I think that's a major issue. But now,
are these concerns, what I'd like to find out from you is, are these concerns valid? Because a number of them say, oh yes, we used to be partisan, but we're no longer partisan. We've resigned our membership of political parties. Should that count?
I think, yes, it should count. But I think it's also the question, how do you find some of each case has to be taken on its individual merit. With respect to the recs that have been nominated right now, and I think the most particular ones are the ones from the Southeast, where it appears that virtually all of the recs coming from the Southeast are tainted and who appear to have been nominated by a particular governor in the Southeast. And I think the president should have been much more conscious of national interest in accepting those nominations from a partisan governor who even went beyond his state to make nominations from other states in the Southeast. So I think that it's something that the Senate needs to be very conscious of and look at all of the issues raised regarding the specific resident electoral commissioners that are being nominated to know what to do. Okay,
I'm going to go straight to naming some of the nominees as named by the coalition of CSOs led by Yaga Africa and what they had against them. This one, they say some of the nominees of the president failed the constitutional test of non-partisanship and unquestionable integrity. Evidence abounds that some of the nominees are either partisan, politically aligned, or previously indicted for corruption, to mention a few. Now, for a number of them, people will argue that there are arguments for and against. Take the example of Professor Lawal Bashir from Sokoto State. It's not clear if he's resigned his membership of the APC, but if he has, for instance, would it matter?
Well, I'm not familiar with that statement, so I really can't comment on its contents. But I do know that there are concerns that if, there's what is called perception. Perception is so very key that it sometimes represents, for politics, it could represent fact in terms of what people believe. And I think that it's not just about the independence of INEC. It must be that INEC is seen to be independent. And so I think that when you look at all of these issues and look at persons who are nominated, it must be clear that they have not, by previous conduct and persistent and continuing conduct, continue to manifest partisanship or bias or even political affiliation. So, like I said, each case needs to be taken on its merit.
One of them I find controversial, though, is this one, the nomination of Mrs. Sylvia Uchendago, who is believed to be the younger sister of the APC Deputy National Chairman, Southeast. Now, if you're the younger sister of anybody, should that count? I mean, if you're of a politician, should that count for something? Should that work against you, your nomination? Just speaking curiously.
Yeah, again, like I said, I'm not familiar with that letter or the statement. But bottom line for me, I think, is that every case needs to be taken on its own merit. And if there is evidence that someone, because they are sisters to a leading politician and have shown themselves to be partisan, then I think that the evidence needs to be provided. But the most important thing, I think, is perception. And if the general perception is that because of the circumstance of a person, it is possible, given the circumstance and given their own antecedents, that they would likely be biased and partisan, then I think it's something that the Senate needs to take into account in confirmation.
But do you think that the Senate, this current Senate as you see it, do you think that it has the political will to be able to do a good job of these complaints that have been raised? This is bearing in mind the controversial nomination of Mrs. Loretta Onochie. Do bear in mind that when she was rejected, she wasn't rejected, that because she was thought to be partisan or that she did not meet certain criteria of the Constitution. It was that the slot for her state, which she was seeking to represent, was already taken up. That for a number of people, even though, yes, it was means to an end, it was not the reason which they had, adduced in the very first instance.
There must be a reason for rejecting a nominee, and sometimes the real reason may not be what is stated, and it may actually be that with respect to Mrs. Onochie, the issue that came up, there were several reasons, and so they chose the one that seemed to be easier for her to absorb, and I think it was the truth that the nominee for her state, or that slot, wasn't empty at the time. What we believe is that you really need to look at all of the facts that are presented before you, and we believe that this Senate committee, knowing that there is elections only a few months ahead, 6 months ahead, would not want to give the impression that the electoral body has been filled up and stuffed up with partisan members. So my sense and my hope is that this committee, looking at all of the issues, would find sufficient reason to examine the complaints made by different people, NGOs, political parties who have complained about particular nominees. Sometimes people may complain because of some personal issues as well. It is really then up to the committee to look at how best to sift the truth from the fabrications and make a decision that is in the best interest of our elections.
Do you think our laws need to be clearer? I know that, yes, the law already says non-partisanship and must be people of unquestionable integrity. That's what it requires. But do you think it needs to be more specific, looking at some of the issues that have been raised here? Because I'm sure that if you speak with some of the nominees here, they certainly will have defenses. A number of them will say, okay, so we maybe, I'm just imagining, and I've had conversations with quite a number of people, and these are some of the reasons that you will hear, that, oh, we have not been given a chance to clear our names. These are allegations that have been made against us. Do you think that the laws need to be clearer in terms of the requirements for nominations into positions like this?
Well, I think that the clearest thing that was proposed was by the Uwais Committee, which talked about the process of nomination. But President Jonathan, in his wisdom, when he accepted the recommendations of the committee, did not create an independent nominating body for members of the Electoral Commission. So if that had been accepted, that recommendation, then it would have been within the purview and powers of the National Judicial Council to take that responsibility. But the practicality of it as well couldn't also have insulated the possibility that people with political interests and affiliations might still get in. So at the end of the day, it's in the hands of a president who has to be nationalistic, a president who has to have the greater interest of the country at heart to take charge and do what is right. And this is what is being questioned right now. Has this president done the right thing? Has he acted in the national interest? Given the way in which several other nominations and appointments that he has made across different positions since his tenure, is this consistent with it? A lot of people do not believe that this president has always acted in national interest in making appointments into positions.
What sense do you have?
I think that the president should have been more circumspect, should have asked more questions. And I think what pains me the most is that you did have resident electoral commissioners who did excellently well. Most of the resident electoral commissioners that didn't get recommended back in, what was their offense? And how can you nominate new persons 6 months to an election? I don't think the president acted in national interest. I think that this is why the issues are arising as to partisanship and why some of these partisan elements are being questioned.
How do you think this matter should be resolved, considering the objections that the CSOs have raised and the time frame left to be able to address these issues? You've already spoken about how we have just 6 months to the polls.
You can't put out something in the air without going to the members of the committee. You have to go to the members of the committee. You have to provide evidence. You have to know that the committee has to have fair hearing for those that you have accused of being partisan. All of that has to be in the terrain and purview and view of the members of that committee, so they can make a decision. A lot of times people say things about people which may be false, which may be correct, but it goes and people can objectively look at it.
Welcome back. You're watching Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. Our guest tonight is Mr. Clement Nwankwo of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC. And we're talking about the newly nominated names of resident electoral commissioners sent to the National Assembly for confirmation. Let me take you over to another matter, completely different. I know that on the 23rd of August, just last month, we're in September now, so quickly, there was a public hearing on a new matter, a bill for an act to establish the National Electoral Offences Commission and for related matters in 2022. That itself has also stirred up a different kettle of, I don't want to say controversy. It's not that controversial, but I think there are sides for and against the establishment of this bill. There are those who think that we need it, and there are those who think this is not necessary, that we have sufficient bodies to be able to handle this. From what you have studied of this particular bill, and I'm sure what you know of other, existing acts of agencies of government set up to be able to take care of crimes and criminality, especially in whatever circumstance we find ourselves, would you really say that this is a bill, this is an act, if it eventually becomes one, that is necessary for us to have?
Again, it comes from the half nature of implementation of the recommendations of the Ways Electoral Reform Committee. In 2007, when that committee was set up and it submitted its report, part of the recommendations was to create an electoral offences political parties regulation, and electoral offences commission, and even tribunal. This wasn't ever followed up. And so what you have seen is the metamorphosis of different electoral offences. Electoral offences rose from simply rigging, snatching ballot boxes, and when INEC began to improve and snatching ballot boxes couldn't become an issue, you began to see vote buying, you began to see electoral violence, and all manners of abuse of the electoral process. Now, the recommendation for an Electoral Offences Commission is that it be there to bring to account persons who violate the electoral law. So the idea of an Electoral Offences Commission is to have a body that has responsibility for apprehending offenders, taking them, investigating, and prosecuting them. Now, there's a divergence as to whether you should also have an electoral offences tribunal. I personally don't think so. I think that you should charge them before the regular courts, and that's what this new bill is proposing. Except that in this new bill, in presenting, what I was asked to do is present an overview of what the Senate had passed and what the House was building on. And part of what came out from the public hearing was that people asked questions about the composition. And that means that in the Senate version, it talked about members, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Interior, the police, all manners of government agencies, such that the membership of the commission is constituted almost 75% by government agencies. That's not an independent Electoral Offences Commission bill. And that's what came out in the public hearing, that most people said, look, review the composition, review the punishments prescribed. Punishments must be commensurate with offenses. Where you prescribe 20 years jail term for snatching of ballot box, that's going to be difficult for anybody to enforce. So that's part of what the committee is doing now, taking all of the input from the public hearing and trying to produce a bill that addresses the need for independence.
This is interesting. So the Senate has already passed this?
The Senate has passed it, yes.
Oh dear. So it's waiting for concurrence on the part of the House?
It's waiting for the House to pass its own, and the House is not doing concurrence. The House is going through the process because it wants to get more feedback from people, and that's what happened at the public hearing.
Well, in a previous conversation which we had with a lawyer who spoke to Channels Television, he was very, very unequivocal. He thinks that, this is a waste of time, that the passage of this is a waste of time. He thinks that there are sufficient government bodies already in existence capable of, handling electoral offenses. And we understand that at the public hearing, I think the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the EFCC, which has now been involved in trying to ensure that crimes committed around election, on election day are prosecuted or at least are prevented, also raised objection to the creation of this. What do you think about the intervention of the EFCC?
We have to go back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, there was only the Nigerian police.
Indeed.
And then you began to find that there were crimes that were more difficult and required specialized handling. And that's part of the justification for the creation of the EFCC. That's part of the justification for the creation of the NDLEA. That's part of the justification for the creation of even the ICPC and even the auxiliary security forces like the NCDC and so on. What is happening is that those original jurisdictions conferred on the originating bodies continue to dissipate, and the ability to prosecute fails. And that's why INEC is saying to you, you gave us those powers, we can't deal with it. And it's apparent. It's not because they don't want to, but they're already overburdened. And that's why the agitation for a specialized body to deal with this. And given the nature of it, the foundation of our democracy is elections. I mean, elections, of course, does not constitute democracy, but that's the basis on which you found democracy. So it's important to make sure that it goes really well. And it's been work in progress for a while, and we've come quite some way. We must commend, even if we criticize, but we must commend the metamorphoses and the developments and improvements with the electoral system, including INEC.
How many more would we have? Do you think it is possible to mandate one of these agencies, maybe, for instance, the NSCDC, to be able to successfully prosecute, crimes around electoral offenses? Yeah,
it's always a question, how many more agencies should you create? And I don't advocate, in fact, I believe that a lot of agencies need to be chopped off if you do implement the Onsai report. But the foundation of our democracy is an electoral system that everyone respects and everyone follows the process. Having an agency to do so, and I have also had people talk about the cost of setting up a new commission. Having an agency that helps us to improve our democracy, to bring people to account, because that's the most important thing. How can you bring someone to account who has a bullion van or has a vehicle somewhere and is sending monies out to people to buy votes? How do you bring to account politicians who arm thugs to disrupt the electoral process? How do you bring to account, if you look at the electoral violence that occurred in Nigeria in 2011, where thousands of people were killed and nobody to date has been prosecuted? How do you bring those kinds of people to account if you don't have a strong, well-mandated body to do so?
For the same reason which you give, that the constitution of this particular body has now been frowned upon, there'll be questions as to how we can make that particular body independent were it to sail through.
Well, it's to make it independent. It doesn't have to be housed anywhere, and that's why the composition becomes important. You can't have ministries represented in it. You can't even have INEC represented in it. Its membership must be founded on independent, non-partisan, credible Nigerians who are empowered to give teeth to its powers and functions. And as long as you can do that, then you would begin to build an independent, strong body. And we have seen that happen with INEC, that today you have an INEC, a few questions asked, criticisms made, but overall, everyone satisfied that the commission can be, and a lot of times has been, independent in its functions.
Clement Nwankwo, Executive Director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, PLAC. Thank you so much for coming on Hard Copy.
Thank you, Mope.
Well, that's the program tonight. To let us know what your thoughts are on the issues that we have raised here using the handles showing on your screen. Thank you for watching. I'm Nwankwo Yusuf. Good night.